The morning I realized a $1 million construction project was about to lose a fight against water, nobody believed me. And honestly, if I hadn't grown up on that land, I probably wouldn't have believed me either. The strange thing is the disaster didn't start with a flood, a storm, or some dramatic act of nature. It started with a convoy of shiny white pickup trucks rolling down a frost-covered hill on an October morning while I stood on my back porch holding a cup of coffee. I remember the sound before I really saw them. Tires crunching over frozen ground, diesel engines humming through the cold air. I lived outside the little town of Ashford Ridge, Virginia, on property that had been in my family for generations. It wasn't some giant ranch or wealthy estate. It was just old family land, the kind that collects stories the same way old barns collect dust. My grandfather farmed part of it. My father hunted deer on it. And after both of them were gone, I stayed. Most people thought I stayed because I was stubborn. Maybe they were right. That morning, I watched a dozen workers jump out of trucks carrying survey equipment and bright orange markers. At first, I figured it was another utility project. We got those every few years. Then I heard one of the foremen yell something that made my stomach tighten. He pointed toward a low slope beyond the tree line and shouted, "Community center goes right there." The men laughed and started unloading equipment. I lowered my coffee and stared at the spot he was pointing toward. Of all the places they could have chosen, they picked that one. I must have stood there for 30 seconds without moving. Then I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was so unbelievably stupid. "Oh no," I muttered. "You idiots." A few hours later, I drove over to see what was happening. The development company behind the project had recently bought a large tract of neighboring land and announced plans for an upscale residential community called Willow Creek Estates. The brochures showed walking trails, decorative ponds, luxury homes, and a beautiful clubhouse overlooking what they described as scenic natural terrain. What they called scenic natural terrain was what my grandfather used to call wet ground that remembers where water wants to go. There's a difference. Most people see land. Farmers see behavior. My grandfather had spent half his life teaching me that. The project manager was standing near a trailer reviewing blueprints when I introduced myself. His name was Brandon Keller. He looked maybe 30 years old, wore mirrored sunglasses even though the sun barely showed through the clouds, and carried himself with the confidence of a guy who had never been seriously wrong about anything. "Can I help you?" he asked. "Maybe," I said. "Depends on whether you're planning to build that clubhouse where I think you're planning to build it." He smiled politely. "We're building exactly where the engineers approved." "Then your engineers missed something." His smile faded a little. "Like what?" I pointed toward the slope. "There's an old watershed under that ground." He glanced over his shoulder. "Not according to our reports." "Well, according to 80 years of local history, it's there." He folded his arms. "Ma'am, we've done geological studies, environmental reviews, soil testing. Everything meets state requirements. The word ma'am always hits different when someone uses it to dismiss you." I drove home irritated but not yet worried. People ignore warnings all the time. Usually reality educates them eventually. The problem was that reality can get expensive. Over the next several weeks, the construction accelerated. Bulldozers removed native grasses. Excavators carved into the slope. Concrete trucks arrived almost daily. Every time I drove past, I felt the same uneasy feeling in my chest. It wasn't anger yet. It was more like watching someone walk toward a cliff while wearing headphones. Around Thanksgiving, I dug through old family records stored in my father's workshop. Most of it was ordinary stuff. Tax documents, crop notes, hunting licenses. Then I found something interesting. An old survey map from the 1940s showing seasonal groundwater movement beneath several properties, including the exact section where the development was being built. The paper was yellow and fragile, but the markings were still clear. I made copies and brought them directly to Brandon. He looked at them for maybe 5 seconds before handing them back. "These aren't part of our official records. That doesn't make them wrong. It means they aren't relevant." I still remember the irritation in his voice. Like I was wasting his afternoon. Like decades of local knowledge were somehow less valuable than a report written by someone who had probably visited the property twice. As I walked back to my truck, I looked over my shoulder at the rising concrete foundations and had a feeling I couldn't shake. It wasn't just that they were making a mistake. It was that they were absolutely convinced they couldn't make one. And in my experience, that's usually when trouble starts. By January, the first signs showed up, and they showed up exactly where I knew they would. We had a fairly normal winter that year. Nothing dramatic, no record snowfall, no 100-year storm, just cold temperatures and the occasional stretch of rain that Virginia gets when winter can't decide what season it wants to be. One afternoon, I drove past the construction site on my way home from town and noticed 3 portable pumps running near the foundation trenches. At first glance, that might not sound unusual. Construction crews pump water all the time, but these pumps weren't there after a storm. They were there after nearly a week of dry weather. That caught my attention. A few days later, I stopped again. The pumps were still running. Water shimmered along the bottom of the trenches like liquid metal. Workers stood around talking while a backhoe operator repeatedly cleared mud that seemed to reappear overnight. One of the laborers looked exhausted. I asked him if they were having drainage problems. He glanced around before answering. Ground won't stay dry. Rainwater? I asked. He shook his head. That's the weird part. It keeps coming back. I almost told him exactly why, but he looked like he'd already figured out more than his supervisors wanted him to. February arrived, and things got worse. The parking area they had graded near the future clubhouse developed patches of standing water. Overnight freezes turned sections of it into slick sheets of ice. Residents in nearby neighborhoods started talking. Nobody said it publicly at first, but rumors spread fast in small communities. The expensive new development that promised luxury living suddenly had workers skating across the construction site before sunrise. One Saturday morning, I was having breakfast at Miller's Diner when I overheard 2 contractors talking in the next booth. They're bleeding money over there, one of them said. Every time they dry it out, more water comes up. His friend laughed. Maybe they built a marina by accident. I smiled in my coffee, but said nothing. The truth was, I wasn't enjoying any of this. People imagine that being proven right feels satisfying. Sometimes it does. But watching a preventable disaster unfold mostly feels frustrating. I had warned them. More importantly, the land had warned them for decades. They just chose not to listen. A week later, I decided to call the county environmental office. After being transferred 3 times, I finally reached an inspector named Elaine Morris. She sounded tired before I even explained why I was calling. Apparently, she had already received several complaints related to the project. I told her everything I knew about the hidden watershed and the old groundwater channels beneath the slope. There was a long pause on the line. Finally, she said, "Do you have documentation? Some historical surveys?" "Yes." Another pause. Then she said something that changed the entire course of the story. "If you can prove historical hydrology, especially predating current development records, we may have grounds to investigate." I sat there quietly for a moment. "May?" She laughed softly. "I'm a county employee. We never promise anything." That night, I couldn't sleep. Around midnight, I walked into my father's old workshop with a flashlight and started searching through every cabinet, drawer, and filing box I could find. The place still smelled faintly like machine oil and cedar shavings. My father had been gone almost 8 years by then, but sometimes when I opened those old drawers, I could almost hear him muttering while he worked. Most of the records were things I'd already seen before. Property boundaries, equipment manuals, tax receipts. Then I found a steel document box shoved beneath a workbench. I hadn't opened it in years. The hinges squealed when I lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of folders organized in my father's handwriting. I spent nearly 2 hours sorting through them before one label caught my eye. Watershed Basin Number 7. My pulse actually sped up. I pulled the folder out and opened it carefully. Inside was a treasure trove. Hand-drawn maps, soil analysis reports, photographs dating back to the 1950s, letters exchanged between local landowners and federal conservation officials. There was even a report documenting seasonal recharge patterns beneath the exact area where the clubhouse was being built. I sat down on an old stool and just stared at the papers. It felt like my father and grandfather had reached across time to hand me the evidence themselves. The next morning I scanned everything. Then I called Elaine back. By the end of the week, county officials had copies of every document. That's when things started moving faster than I expected. Engineers visited the site. Survey crews returned. Monitoring equipment appeared. Suddenly, the same project managers who had spent months acting untouchable looked nervous whenever inspectors arrived. Brandon especially seemed different. One afternoon, I ran into him near the site entrance. He looked tired. The confidence was still there, but cracks were beginning to show. "You've certainly gotten people's attention," he said. "I didn't get anybody's attention," I replied. "The water did." He frowned. "You know what I mean?" "Yeah, Ido." For a second, neither of us spoke. Then he said, "Do you have any idea what this delay is costing?" I couldn't help myself. "Do you have any idea what ignoring local history is costing?" That landed harder than he expected. He turned and walked away without answering. Around that same time, local media started calling. A reporter named Rachel Kim reached out after hearing about the environmental investigation. At first, I declined. I wasn't interested in becoming some local celebrity. But after thinking about it, I realized public attention might be the only thing keeping the situation from disappearing behind closed doors. So I agreed to an interview. We met near the edge of my property on a gray afternoon. I spread copies of the old maps across the hood of my Subaru while cameras rolled. Rachel asked why I cared so much about stopping the project. That question bothered me because it assumed I was trying to stop progress. I wasn't. I wasn't against development. I wasn't against new neighbors. I wasn't against growth. What I was against was arrogance. "People think water forgets," I told her. "It doesn't. You can cover it with concrete. You can ignore it. You can erase it from paperwork. But water remembers where it belongs." The clip aired 2 nights later. By morning, everyone was talking about it. Some people supported me. Others thought I was an old woman trying to interfere with economic growth. A few online comments accused me of wanting property values to stay low. One guy somehow concluded I was part of a conspiracy against developers. The internet is a fascinating place. But while people argued online, the actual situation on the ground kept getting worse. The pumps never stopped. New sections of the site developed standing water. Fresh cracks appeared near portions of the foundation. Workers hauled in gravel by the truckload only to watch sections sink again. Then came the day everything changed. County engineers completed their formal analysis and released preliminary findings. I wasn't present when the report was delivered, but I heard about it less than an hour later. The site had been built directly over an active groundwater recharge basin. Not a former basin, not a theoretical one, an active one, the kind that continuously feeds surrounding water systems. In other words, the exact thing I had been warning about from the beginning. Construction was immediately suspended pending further review. When I drove past later that evening, the site looked strangely quiet. Equipment sat idle. Workers gathered in small groups talking. Nobody seemed sure what would happen next. For the first time in months, the developers weren't dictating events. The land was, and the land had just started speaking louder than anyone expected. The strange thing about winning a fight like that is that it doesn't happen all at once. There isn't usually some dramatic movie moment where everyone suddenly admits you were right and the credits start rolling. Real life is messier than that. After construction was suspended, there were weeks of meetings, reports, legal reviews, engineering assessments, and enough paperwork to bury a small town. But while lawyers argued and consultants produced expensive presentations, the ground kept doing what it had always done. Water continued rising. Pumps ran day and night. Temporary drainage systems were installed, modified, expanded, and then expanded again. Nothing worked for very long. I drove past the site several times during those weeks, not because I wanted to celebrate their problems, but because I genuinely couldn't believe how quickly the situation was unraveling. The developers had spent millions trying to force the land into becoming something it was never meant to be. Nature was sending the bill. By early spring, rumors started spreading that investors were getting nervous. Contractors were waiting on payments. Additional engineering fixes were projected to cost millions more. Then one afternoon, I received a call from Elaine. Her voice sounded different this time, almost relieved. "The permits are being withdrawn," she said. I sat quietly for a moment. "All of them. The clubhouse project is finished." I thanked her and hung up. Then I just sat at my kitchen table staring out the window. I expected to feel victorious. Instead, I felt tired. Maybe because the outcome had never really been about beating anyone. It was about preventing people from making a mistake that should never have happened in the first place. A few days later, I drove to the property one final time. The scene looked surreal. The partially completed clubhouse still stood there, but now sections of the surrounding ground were flooded. Water reflected the unfinished walls. Tall grasses were already beginning to reclaim the edges. The expensive building looked less like a luxury community centerpiece and more like an abandoned monument to overconfidence. As I stood there, I spotted Brandon walking across the site. For a second, I considered getting back into my truck. Then he noticed me and started walking over. He looked older than he had 6 months earlier. Stress will do that to a person. We stood there awkwardly for a moment before he finally spoke. "You know," he said, staring at the water, "when this started, I thought you were just another neighbor trying to stop development." I laughed softly. "You're not the first person who's thought that." He nodded. Then he surprised me. I should have listened. There wasn't any anger in his voice. No sarcasm. No excuse. Just honesty. I looked out toward the flooded basin. "Honestly, Brandon, it wasn't me you should have listened to." He followed my gaze. Neither of us said anything for several seconds. Finally, he shook his head and laughed. "You really love that line, don't you? The water remembers?" I smiled. "Yeah, because it keeps being true." For the first time since we'd met, he laughed too. Then he wished me well and walked away. That was the last time I ever saw him. Over the following year, nature moved back and faster than any restoration crew could have managed. Native grasses returned. Birds nested along the water's edge. The flooded sections attracted frogs by the hundreds. On warm spring evenings, their chorus echoed across the basin exactly the way my grandfather used to describe when I was a kid. One night, I walked out there alone under a bright moon and stood quietly listening. The air smelled clean. The water reflected the stars. And for the first time since all of this began, I felt completely at peace. I thought about my father. I thought about my grandfather. I thought about all those old maps sitting in forgotten boxes for decades, waiting for someone to need them again. Most people think history lives in books. Sometimes it lives in the ground beneath your feet. Sometimes it lives in stories old families tell around kitchen tables. And sometimes the people who seem old-fashioned are simply carrying information nobody else bothered to keep. Looking back now, I don't think this story is really about developers, environmental regulations, or even a failed construction project. I think it's about what happens when confidence becomes arrogance. Somewhere along the way, too many people started believing technology automatically knows more than experience, that a report is always smarter than local knowledge, that if something isn't recorded in a database, it somehow doesn't exist. But the world doesn't work that way. The land doesn't care about spreadsheets. Water doesn't care about investor presentations. Reality doesn't negotiate. And eventually reality always gets the final vote. Even now, people still argue about what happened. Some say the project should never have been approved. Others insist the developers were treated unfairly and simply got unlucky. A few believe modern engineering could have solved everything if they'd been given enough time and money. Honestly, maybe there's some truth in all of those arguments. That's why I'm curious what you think. If you had been in my position, would you have fought to stop the project, or would you have let the developers learn the lesson on it? And if you were running that project, would you trust decades of local knowledge over official reports and expert studies? Let me know down in the comments, because stories like this rarely have simple answers. And sometimes the most interesting part isn't who won or who lost. It's figuring out who's actually right.